Welcome, welcome. It's so wonderful to see so many folks here tonight. I knew that this was going to be a talk that had broad appeal, and it's lovely to see so many people showing up for it. I'm John Berryhill, the director of the Botanic Garden. I always like to take this evening to say happy unofficial to spring. I was just joking with Gabby the other day. It's even despite being a winter lover, it feels a little more like January 58th than it does March 6th. But it does seem like the forecast might be such that today the bulb show's arrival marks a turning point, and the sun's coming back, and things will be blooming soon. Before I introduce Peter, I want to share some important information and extend a few important thank yous with everybody. First, as always, after the talk, I hope that you'll join us at Lyman Plant House for a first peek at this year's bulb show. I want to gratefully acknowledge the hard work of our Lyman team, Jimmy Grogan, Dan Babineau, and in particular, our newest member of our team, Caitlin Robertson, who was the primary designer and builder of this year's show, with support from students Abby Coleman and Camille Piperni. While you're there, you'll also see student art installations that have been integrated into this year's show: The Temperature of Breath by Kola Shi and Reflections by Annika Peterson. There's going to be a reception for these two artists this coming Monday, March 9th, from 4:30 to 6 p.m. at Lyman, and everybody's invited to that too. I hope you'll come and bring a friend. Also, as you enter, you will be greeted by one of the most meaningful exhibits that we've ever hosted in the Church Gallery in Lyman, called Co-Inventionema. That spotlights the work of 6 Nipmuc artists and cultural stewards: Rachel Healing Willow Bayless, Willow Daly, Keely Curlis, Scott Strong Hart Foster, Andre Strong Beerhart Gaines, and Kim Toney. Grounded in the enduring relationship between indigenous peoples and the land, this exhibit challenges dominant narratives about environmental knowledge and invites us to into reimagining our collective relationship with the land here in the River Valley and beyond. Also, a special thank you goes out to those who planned and coordinated and helped prepare for tonight's events, as well as the busy 2 weeks ahead, including Sarah Loomis, Julie Thompson, Lily Carone, Sherry Peabody, Liz Whiteley, Anjali D'Souza, Ben Green, Maria Tejado Gonzalez, Grace Harvey, and of course, our many amazing volunteers who are the welcoming faces that so many of our guests see when they come to visit Lyman Plant House. So many of those folks are in the room here tonight, so I hope you'll just join me for a moment in an appreciative round of applause for all that work. To all of you who are members of the Botanic Garden of Smith College, thank you so much. I'm constantly reminded of how vital that support truly is. We simply could not do that work without you. Membership if you're not a member yet, I encourage you to join this wonderful community. Membership comes with a great number of benefits, like free admission to many botanic gardens around the country. I think it's around 400 of them, so it's a great way to support us and also explore more green spaces while probably earning your donation to the Botanic Garden back very quickly. And lastly, I'm truly delighted to introduce our speaker this evening, Peter Grima. If you spend your time, as I do, among passionate botanical enthusiasts, you begin to notice that some of them are simply different. And no, I don't mean that as a polite euphemism for bizarre. Though to be clear, the botanical world does have its share of delightful eccentrics, and we cherish all of them. What I mean is that there are a rare few, who seem less like visitors in botanical landscapes and more like participants in it. Spend an hour in a New England green space with Peter, and you will quickly recognize what all great teachers and mentors possess: a warm and contagious curiosity that makes you want to slow down and look more closely. He has the remarkable ability to help others find their own sense of home among the leaves. I've heard friends describe Peter as a human encyclopedia of botanical knowledge, one who shares his insights not with fanfare, but with quiet generosity. The kind of knowledge that can only be gathered through years of patient attention, muddy boots, and the willingness to notice what most of us simply walk past. As our work at the Botanic Garden of Smith College has stepped more firmly towards native plant conservation, we've come to rely on tools like iNaturalist that connect scientists and devoted naturalists in powerful ways. More than once, we have searched for a nearby occurrence of some obscure or stubbornly elusive species, only to discover that Peter has already been there, noticed it, documented it, and gently added it to this collective record, doing us a great service. It is both reassuring and slightly humbling to realize that if there's a rare plant blooming within a 30-mile radius, Peter probably knows about it. That support became more real this fall as Peter guided my colleagues, interns, and me while seed collecting on the summit of Mount Greylock this fall. A lovely adventure that affirmed for all of us the potential synergy between public land stewardship and botanical collections. Peter's a forester, a botanist, and a writer based here in Western Massachusetts. His work focuses on floristic inventories of landscapes and the ecology and biogeography of rare species. He is the co-author of The Vascular Flora of Franklin County, Massachusetts, a recent update to the flora of the Mount Holyoke Range, and an upcoming flora of Mount Toby. He's collected more than 1,500 botanical herbarium specimens, proof of where his curiosity has led him. His intellectual range extends beautifully into the literary world as well, which brings him here tonight. Peter has published in the Emily Dickinson Journal and presented at meetings of the Emily Dickinson International Society. He's collaborated on the Dickinson Herbarium inspired anthracite photography project, This Earthen Door, with visual artists Amanda Merchand and Leah Sobsey. He is also co-author of the forthcoming Emily Dickinson's World of Flowers with Baihua Wang. As our outdoor collections at Smith College increasingly focus on native plants and the ecological communities that they sustain, we're reminded that this work depends on people who are deeply rooted in place. People who observe carefully, think generously, and share what they know. Peter is one of those rare and generous souls. We're fortunate to have him with us, and I suspect that by the end of the evening, we will all see both our favorite landscapes and poems with new eyes. Please join me in welcoming Peter. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, John, for that incredibly warm welcome. And thank you all for coming out on a kind of raw Friday evening and filling seats and making it worth my time to share with you something that I hope you'll be fascinated with, something that's fascinated me. So thank you to the Botanic Garden, especially John and Sarah and all the people that helped coordinate this evening and put on the bulb show that I'm really excited to participate in also later, afterwards. This is a pleasure to be here to talk about two of my favorite things, plants and poetry. And I've given a similar talk in Boston last year, which was special to me because I was once a Bostonian, believe it or not. But to really bring Emily Dickinson to a Western Mass audience is something, a general Western Mass audience that's not scholars and professors, is really something I haven't done yet, and that's really rewarding to me, having lived here for 20 plus years. So this is where the residents, we were generally pretty proud to have this poet in our backyard, and there's a special level of attention to anything Emily Dickinson here. So, every reader tends to want to see Emily Dickinson in her work, and that became really true for me when I started finally in my late 30s being drawn to her poetry and seeing botanical reference after botanical reference and saying, this person knew something that was that I can relate to. And that really just jumped to life for me when I found, or I saw a copy of her herbarium, a digital facsimile of her herbarium. And that it wasn't just a person who mentioned wildflowers, but who had experienced them in much the same way as I had. And importantly, I learned my botany on this same landscape at UMass in grad school. So the imprint of the botanical landscape that she experienced is very similar, and there's a lot of resonance with what I've experienced. And that sort of ignited a passion for this subject, which has evolved into a research focus and is now a sort of all-consuming application that could last me many years. With Dickinson, it's not just potent from a purely botanical standpoint. It's also all this biographical and literary context that comes with it. When you think about immortality in Dickinson's poetry, it's such a prevalent theme. And I think of herbarium specimens as really immortalizing a moment. Not just the plant, but the sort of the union of the person and the plant and the place in that point of time. These are like little droplets of immortality is how I think of them. And when you take those specimens in aggregate, it really becomes an autobiographical narrative of how this person spent part of their lives. But herbarium specimens also kind of exist in darkness. They're collected and they're put in books, or right now, a more modern context, they're put in cabinets. And unless you use them, engage with them, they don't tell the stories that are preserved in them. So really re-engaging with all of these plants is a way to re-engage with the person who collected them, who happens to be Emily Dickinson in this case. And Dickinson, she really can't be read or understood without understanding her botanical touch points, so to speak. It's not just the flowers, but floral parts, movements of flowers, interactions with pollinators, the progression from dormancy all the way through, from dormancy through the growing season until senescence. All of these, her poetry is quite literally floral through and through, invoking all of these botanical contexts. And even sometimes poems that seem to have no botanical context at all have botanical imagery sort of woven into the background that sort of peeks through unexpectedly. So this really, there's an additional dimension to this with the wildflowers, because she's well known as a gardener, and her experience in the garden is intimate and important. But with the wildflowers, that implies a dimension of experience, exploring, discovering, going to all these different habitats that really illustrates a whole different dimension that really hasn't been explored with her. And the herbarium is really the primary evidence that she possessed these experiences and brings them into her work, brought them into her work later. So this evening I'm going to have sort of two parts. I'm going to begin with talking about the object itself, the herbarium, the book, and then later we'll get into how do we use that book to get perspectives into her world and her work. So importantly, this is the only book she created in her lifetime. It is a book that was specifically labeled for herbarium creation. It was a very popular activity, especially with young ladies at the time, which she mentions in a letter that we'll get to in a minute here. This is about a little bigger than letter size, 10 by 13 sheet size. And this was produced by G&C Merriam in Springfield before they got sidetracked with producing Webster's Dictionary. They produced all sorts of other things. So there's 66 pages. She filled every page, top to bottom, with 424 specimens. They're unique specimens. There are some repeat species, but I don't consider them redundant or duplicates, since they're distinct from each other. This is a finished product. She didn't collect a green plant, put it in this book, and close it and let it sit there. She had a different process for that. We'll talk a little bit about that further on, but this is a finished product. This is a composition, so to speak. And this really, everybody that's looked at this in the last 100 years, or I guess it was in the 50s that it came to light, has been, wow, that is really impressive. Just the quality of the specimens, the arrangement, the selection is just exemplary. But mostly most of what I've read about it when I started taking this on was kind of critical or not exactly flattering to it. There is no discernible order. Some things are ordered within it, but there's not scientific order, as if you were creating some sort of a reference point like a scientist. And then this is Richard Sewell, one of her principal biographers in the mid to late 20th century, he praised this object, but really kind of diminutized it by saying the product and delight of her girlhood, because it's been assumed for a long time that she just created this whole thing as a teenager and then put it on a shelf, and then many years later she became a poet. So it became kind of detached and irrelevant, but still amazing. And that just never sat right with me. And that started rolling around in my head, and the more I thought about it, the more I felt like there was more to learn there, which you're going to get to hear tonight. So the singular piece of evidence that says that she did this when she was a teenager is this quote from a letter when she was 14 to her friend to buy a root. Have you made you an herbarium yet? She doesn't actually say, I'm making an herbarium, but she kind of implies that all the girls are making one, maybe she is too. And that she also offers to send a leaf and to sort of begin this exchange of herbarium specimens. This is the evidence that she made this when she was 14. And I maintained a productive skepticism with that, but the more then I started looking into it, and things started to support that, which is problematic when you're trying to disprove a hypothesis. But there was a piece of evidence that was kind of buried in somebody's thesis from 1961. There was a very well-known co-editor of the letters, Thomas Johnson's administrative assistant, Theodora Ward, was a handwriting expert, had dated many Emily Dickinson letters and poems. And she apparently had looked at the handwriting, because nearly all of the specimens are labeled in Dickinson's hand. And she squarely placed it as, let me read the quote here. Certainly no earlier than 13 and no later than 14. So 1844 to 1845, which 1845 is the date of that letter from the previous slide. So that seems to check out. And we do know a fair bit about what she was doing in 1845. She was attending Amherst Academy, where she mentions that botany was one of her subjects. She was using this textbook, Elmira Lincoln Phelps's Familiar Lectures on Botany, which has a whole chapter on how to create an herbarium. She was also using Amos Eaton's, one or more editions of Amos Eaton's manual at Flora of North America at the time, because she was using the nomenclature right here. This matches up. And even right down to this, all of her labels have this idiosyncratic extra punctuation. And she's even using this bizarre dash, underline, whatever this is, which is almost a precursor. If you're familiar with Dickinson's poetry, she's a chronic user of the dash in all sorts of serial ways. And this is almost an early precursor to idiosyncratic dash, which maybe she got from Amos Eaton. She also had a copy of Edward Hitchcock's catalog of plants growing without cultivation of his vicinity of Amherst College, which she mentions much later in a letter to Thomas Wentworth Higginson. And I love this quote because she's basically saying she consoled herself as a child in the winter by reading this manual, which is not a picture book. It's literally just a list of species that grow in the Amherst area. It's truly a botanist disposition. But she also studied botany, most likely at Mount Holyoke. She was there for just a year, and she mentions going out in nature. And we know that Mary Lyon was a strong proponent of making botany part of the curriculum, and collecting herbarium specimens was a compulsory part of the coursework. In this quote here, she mentions there are not many wildflowers near, for the girls have driven them to a distance because they've been collecting them into oblivion for their coursework, is the implication there. There's actually an existing student herbarium in the Mount Holyoke College archives of this Hannah Louisa Plimpton, who was a student just a year before Dickinson was there. Similar but different. These are really large specimens. They're also labeled with common name, scientific name, and family, so there's a little bit more information. The labels are written directly on the page, whereas all of Dickinson's labels are on separate strips of paper. So there's some important differences here. And even though one of her biographers just flippantly supposed that maybe Dickinson was exempt from botany, I think it's more likely she probably took a botany course. I guess I kept this slide in here, but just a quick aside, Dickinson's herbarium happens to have the exact same two rare species on the same page as Hannah Louisa Plimpton, which is, I think, worth noting. I don't know what it means yet, but so one might assume that if somebody the year before was doing this as part of her coursework, that maybe Dickinson probably did too, and maybe she had a book just like this that she was working on. And I think we're actually looking at it. That's actually the object we have in hand, because there is a lot of evidence that that's been mentioned but not really explored, that this book had a different set of plants in it at some point. So there are several erased labels. So this is ghosted partridge berry, which has the scientific and the common name written on the page. Slightly larger handwriting, but still in Dickinson's handwriting. And the first 15 of 66 pages all have evidence of little glue strips of paper and plants that were ripped out, and torn paper and glue residue and things like that. So the first 15 pages had a different existence at some point, which I suspect and have hypothesized and published that might have been her Mount Holyoke College version. And there's one object that kind of ties this hypothesis together that hadn't really gotten any attention, and that is what I've called the choir. It's a separate little packet of plants. It's also at Harvard in the Emily Dickinson collection, and I had the great privilege of having a personal audience of these plants, which I don't know if anybody ever has looked at them, but Houghton Library was very gracious to let me take a look. At first, it seems very similar to the herbarium. A few plants, very in Dickinson aesthetics, with little strips of paper. And in this case, there's a few labels, and they're written right on the page. They're not on separate strips of paper, which is an important detail. Same handwriting, and a quick side note, seeing this in person, you can read about dimensions, but until you see how this is almost microscopic handwriting. When she was young, she was writing maybe with a magnifying glass, like 2 to 3 millimeters tall. These strips of paper are about 1 millimeter wide, just truly detailed work. But this quickly changes in the choir. The second page is a couple mounted specimens, but then the remainder were found loose, and they were mounted with this white fabric tape by curators. And the rest of them were all loose. It wasn't full. And you notice these also aren't quite Dickinson aesthetic. This is kind of a gigantic specimen with lots of extra material. There's a withered leaf here, things that probably would have been edited out if it were going to be finally mounted. And there's also a lot of duplicate material, which if you've ever tried to create a specimen that is a superlative, you want to have options, especially with delicate flowers. This to me was clearly a work in progress. This is like Dickinson in the act of getting her herbarium stuff together. And this sort of previews a final format that you see over and over and over again in the finished herbarium. This representative leaf and a superlative flower overlaid. And she was preserving sort of the essence of the organism, but rendering it or editing it into a minimally occupied space, which I think is really similar to the process of editing a poem. So these are, I think of these as compositions, not just compositions, but really concise compositions that she had a very specific ideal in mind for. So the choir is a work in progress, or a poet in progress. And so just to recap this, so the choir has the same labels. So these are also 1845-ish vintage. And then the book, I suspect, was from Mount Holyoke. And some point in the later, the Emily Dickinson Journal article explains this in much greater detail, but my hypothesis is that at least all of the labeled specimens existed in some choir-type format. And at some unknown later date, this book was repurposed, specimens pulled out, and all of the things she collected and labeled when she was 15 or 14, she then used those existing labels and cut them out and used them to glue her plants down into the book again. So these two things came together into a remanifested at some unknown later date. And when that happened is very important, and we don't know, but I can tell you it's not when she was 14. It's a very important detail. Maybe it happened right after she left Mount Holyoke, but there's a couple important possibilities to consider. One, that she was doing this at the same time as when she was creating her fascicles of poetry. So when she was in late 1850s through the 1860s, she was making clean copy of poems and stitching them together in these little booklets that are known as the fascicles, and that's sort of the bulk of her work, their secret work. And maybe she was also reconstructing this herbarium in that same period. So these are sort of concomitant creations, compositions. Or maybe she also was doing this much later in life when her poetic output really declined because she was taking care of her mother who had had a stroke. And this is how she created her, this was her creative outlet in that phase of her life. These are important possibilities. And remember, the criticism is that this is a disordered object. But the later in her life we allow for that to happen, the more likely she had a really intentional organization for this that was meaningful to her. And it's just not apparent to us. And if you've ever read much of Dickinson's poetry, things not being apparent to us as readers is probably a familiar feeling. But there are also some resonances in there that are hints that she was very deliberate organization. And so it's almost like we have a whole new mystery now that it's not stuck at 14-year-old Emily Dickinson, now we can move it around and see what maybe it makes sense elsewhere in her biography. So that is an important detail because when did she collect these is sort of the question that needed to get out of the way before I could even think about the plants. So let's talk about the plants a little bit. All right, good time. This is what I thought the only thing I was going to do was look at the plants and classify them this way, but one thing led to another. So about 150, so forget about the unclassifiable. There's a seaweed and algae and some unidentified things, so I just put them aside. 150 cultivated species, and this covers everything. Vegetable garden, here we have a potato. Flower garden, there's foxglove. This is a house plant that would have grown in a windowsill or hothouse, glass house. Importantly, she didn't have her glasshouse conservatory that exists at the Emily Dickinson Museum right now. She lived in a different house at this time, so we don't know where she got all of these conservatory plants. There are quite a few in the herbarium, maybe at Amherst College. So there's a big chunk of expected, there's been a lot of attention given to her cultivated plants Emily Dickinson as a gardener. And fitting quote for the occasion, she also if you read her letters, she mentions her hyacinths many, many times. She mentions a rainbow of hyacinths, or she monitors, reports on the status of which one's going to bloom first, and sends specimens of hyacinth. So she was a big bulb person that really got her through the winter, and that is why this bulb show exists, right? That's why we're here. So the next group are things that she would have known as ornamentals that were probably novel that now are living freely in the landscape, one way or another. But she was probably planting them or knew them as so-and-so planted them in town and in the hedgerow or something. One that fascinates me is what I call ruderals, or what broadly known as weeds. These are weeds of gardens, lawns, roadsides, hayfields, anything that grows unintentionally without intended human cultivation. This is another botanical disposition. Probably her classmates were not big into collecting weeds, would be my guess. But she really was recognizing them as beings. It's like the plants are a society, and she's recognizing all these different members of the society and elevating them into the same stratum by making specimens. The balance are are native wildflowers, and I qualify this by saying she might not have, some of these she might have certainly grown, like butterfly weed is known as a wildflower in Amherst. It's actually almost extinct from Western Mass, but in the 19th century it was growing wild, but she could have grown it, just like many people do now. But when I say they're native wildflowers, these were wildflowers growing in the greater Amherst area that were also collected by other botanists during her lifetime, except with precisely one exception, which I'm not going to talk about. So if you look at the balance, so it's about, not that it's a competition, but it really is dominated, to me, in my mind, by wildflowers, because she was pulling, and this includes the ruderals and things. And that dimension really hasn't been given much attention. If you want to learn about the cultivated side of things, I recommend Marta McDowell's Emily Dickinson's Gardening Life. Marta's a good friend of mine. She's a pro, and she's an expert on all things horticulture. And she gave deference to the wildflowers, but she admits that's not her turf. So I saw this deficit, and I feel like I need, as a botanist in Amherst area, I feel like this story needs to be told because this is a huge hole missing in her biography. So, and I guess the second question is not when she collected them, but did she herself collect these all? And I don't know. Is the unfortunate answer to a lot of Dickinson questions. But she had the education to, we went over that. She had the opportunity to, because she was going out. I didn't put the slides in with their quotes of all these adventures with classmates and friends, but this was a routine of them going wildflower picking or searching with her and her sister, her and her friends. And she was pretty much traipsing around the landscape well into her 30s. So she had the opportunity and the proclivity to collect these all. And even if she traded some specimens, chances are she probably had seen them also, and maybe not in the perfect condition, but plausibly she collected them all, I guess is the best we could do. But we do have very scant evidence of her actually going out. This is the only quote that actually ties Emily Dickinson to a botanical foray where they reportedly collected plants and brought them back. And this is from Emily Fowler Ford, childhood friend, who mentions Norwituck, mentions several plants, including pink and white trilliums and yellow lady slippers. Norwituck, a very important feature in Amherst, as I'm sure you know, said to be from Dickinson, the Emily Dickinson Museum. It would have been visible from her bedroom. And she mentions it in a poem when she's describing the things outside of her window as the forehead of a hill. And when I moved here in 2003, Norwituck, the first thing I thought was, it looks like a visage looking east. It was a no-brainer to make that connection. Going back to the letter, there is a pink and white trillium in the herbarium, which is actually kind of hard to find in Amherst, but it's around. And there is a yellow lady slipper, which is not the greatest specimen, so I really don't like this one. It looks like she picked it too young. It's hardly expanded. But turns out there's a few more that were found in the back binding of the herbarium that are a little more, they've been a little buggy in. And this is still extant in Holyoke Range. Actually, John excitedly sent me a picture when he saw some in perfect bloom on a run one day this past spring. So it's become rare because of a lot of things, one of which is deer and habitat change and, things we don't know about. But that's sort of this is maybe the one specimen that literally is tied to an actual memory of somebody that said, Emily and I went walking and we collected flowers. And she really was, and contrary to what the myth I brought with me when I first started reading her, she was out there experiencing this landscape in a really meaningful way well into her 30s. And this is a quote from after her dog died when she mentions that she's exploring but little, meaning she was exploring a lot previously with her dog this is when she was 35 years old. And even if she wasn't collecting plants, she had that plant collecting period and then was re-engaging with those plants for another 20 years after that. Just like anybody that if you have a memory of a place you saw this beautiful flower at a certain time of year, you're revisiting that, reconnecting. So all of those connections are refreshed by continuing to be out in the landscape. All right, so that is about the object. And now how do we sort of use that to project out into the outer world? So I'm really interested in the herbarium as a sort of window into her world. What does it tell us about the Amherst that she knew? And the first thing that really drew me in was because I've done work in the Holyoke Range, and my mentor, Karen Searcy, wrote the Flora of the Holyoke Range, and that was a very special place to me. I saw all of these things that resonated with the Holyoke Range flora, and that shared experience of Emily Dickinson experienced botanizing in the Holyoke Range, which is a really magical botanical place, and so have I. It's a well-known botanical hotspot, not just in the valley, not just in Massachusetts. It's probably in the whole Northeast. This is like one of the most special places. Even single slopes on certain mountains are super special places. And it was where all the botanists from Amherst College, from Mount Holyoke, and the later Mass Agricultural College, they were all going to the Notch to see all the cool stuff and rip it out of the ground and make specimens. They're still there, most of them. Some of the things that jump out at me, I'll just give you some personal experience, a little field trip. Early buttercup, this is a real obligate of rich sedimentary bedrock in the valley. You see it at Sugarloaf and Mount Toby, but I see most of it on the south slopes of the Holyoke Range. It's a bedrock indicator. We have a lot of basalt, mostly basalt in the Holyoke Range. Bird's foot violet, not rare in the state, but it just kind of disappears once you go north of Hampshire County. It's at the northern end, but you can find swaths and swaths of it on the south side of the Holyoke Range. So similarly, early blue violet, this is actually, I think this is a rare species in Massachusetts. It's not listed. Really, she labeled it as Viola palmata, which is a more common Richwoods violet, but I think you'll agree, the leaflet is a dead match for this one. This is really like a limestone, dry limestone or dry basalt, very nutrient-rich site, obligate. Going back to that plant that matched her classmate, it's the world milkweed in the middle there, which is a super rare plant in Massachusetts. There's just a handful of places in the valley to find it, one of the best ones being south side of the Holyoke Range. These basalt glades are just pure magic. And just to exemplify, just to reinforce that, there's certain parts of the Holyoke Range that botanists are going to every year to monitor rare plants. And we're still finding new, super rare plants that have never, like things that have never been seen in Western Mass in these places. Not because they just showed up, it's just it's so diverse and rich and variable that you can't see it all. And that is what makes the Holyoke Range magical. And we're seeing some of that magic in what the selections that Emily Dickinson chose to put in her herbarium. The plant that really brought Dickinson to life for me was the violet wood sorrel, which I think this is the poster child for the Holyoke Range. It's probably at Mount Tom too. Ironically, I don't know anything about Mount Tom. It's on the wrong side of the river. Holyoke Range, I might be an expert. Other people have spent time in Mount Tom. But this one, when I opened the book, and I was actually in the UMass herbarium when I saw Emily Dickinson's herbarium. When I opened that book and saw this plant in there, immediately she was in the middle of the woods and was one of the most magical places I know in Massachusetts. And that was just like shattered my worldview of Emily, the cloistered recluse poet Emily Dickinson. It doesn't often flower in profusion. The spongy moth defoliations in recent years have really helped, but if you see these little violet or clover-looking things with violet centers, tread lightly because you're probably on hallowed ground, I'd say. Another group, I often get questions about climate change, and there are no locations or dates on any of our specimens. At best, we have a year, so that really limits things that have been done with other people like Thoreau's specimens, looking at phenology of Thoreau's, whatever that means. But there are some things in her, if her herbarium is a snapshot in this year of her landscape within plus or minus a town from Amherst, some of the things that are in there are kind of surprising. So these are three of them that in the 19th century, these three plants were collected all across southern New England from a very wide variety of habitats. And now they're basically almost entirely restricted to high elevations in the Berkshire Plateau in what I call the spruce zone, which is actually where I work. So all these photos are from Berkshire County, I believe. And for a variety of reasons, it's not just climate change. There's a lot going on in this picture, but they are northern species whose ranges have contracted. And in particular, this twin flower in the middle, I'd say, is disappearing before our very eyes. It's a real true boreal plant. It's just not resilient to any disturbance in its environment. It's very sensitive to it and just is not thriving. But she saw them before in a different era, before they were fading away, so to speak. And you're probably getting a sense that there's a lot of rare plants, and that's definitely what gets my attention. And I think the last time I tallied it relative to the state list, it changes now and then, there are 21 rare extant species in the herbarium. And the two that haunt me to this day are the two historical, meaning locally extirpated text. So these ones photographed here. And despite John's warm welcome, there are plants I've never seen before. And these photos are not mine. This is my friend Eric Ungbird from North Carolina. And because I've never seen them, at least not in bloom. And they're just not in, they're almost extirpated from all of New England. They haven't been seen in Massachusetts since the early 20th century. And both of them were collected by other botanists in Amherst in the 19th century. And they basically both haven't been seen since Emily Dickinson was alive in Amherst. So this is really just drives home, I love the Holyoke Range part because it reminds me of what I can experience now, like the shared experience. But the extirpated plants really drive home that we're living in a different landscape than she experienced. She lived during the height of agricultural clearing. Amherst has a lot of meadows to this presently, more than most towns, but most of the woods around those meadows were meadows in the 19th century, and they're now basically old field red maple or white pine on old fields that are now wet because the ditches are filled in. Very different landscape, more meadows, more different, and there's all sorts of different pHs that are now just sort of lost to obscurity because of succession to forest. So that's sort of using the herbarium to look out and experience, like, get a picture of her Amherst. What many scholars are more interested in is, like, what does it tell us about her? What does it tell us about her poetry? And I can traipse a little through that. I am not a textual scholar, but I certainly spend a lot of time reading Dickinson's work. And I think I can hack it at this point. So some of the biographically and literarily important plants. So if you were to ask a group of Dickinson scholars, what's the most important plant for Emily Dickinson, you'd probably, I don't think you'd have a fight, but you'd have a spirited debate. But I think they'd all agree that daisy is up there as one of the most important plants. And daisy is, I think of it as a wildflower. It's in a ruderal, it's not a native. It's a ruderal that today grows in meadows and power lines and roadsides and things, hay fields. And in her day, she probably was aware that it had connections to English literature's mentions in Shakespeare and Chaucer that I know nothing about, but I've been told there are very important daisy references in Chaucer that she probably read. But more importantly is how she knew daisy directly. And in her lifetime, daisy was, among other things, a cemetery plant. And the cemeteries in the 19th century were essentially cultural grasslands with periodic disturbances, or anthropogenically derived prairies is another way to think of them. She mentions she uses prairie a lot, and prairie might also be a code word for a cemetery at times. And, thinking of daisies and cemeteries, her arrangement of the daisies as crosswise has been described as a coat of arms, but it could also be representative of a person lying in state, as one of my hypotheses. But how do we know she identified daisies with cemeteries is because she tells us directly, here where daisies fit my head, an island in dishonored grass whom none but daisies know. And she has other mentions elsewhere in her poetry and letters, or alluding to daisies growing on the mound where somebody is buried. And so in this way, they're sort of emissaries of immortality. They're things that to think of daisies is to think of the people who lie beneath them. They straddle life and afterlife. They're rooted in sort of the afterlife, the soil, but they are up in the sphere of the living, facing the sun, sort of balancing these two realms that she tried to straddle with in her own writing. Another way she uses daisy as sort of a personal identity, like becomes daisy, is not a daisy, but is daisy. So this is maybe also allied with her death and cemetery symbology, meaning somebody that's preoccupied with death. But also there's implications of chastity, purity, modesty, and then this obedient or subservient role in kind of worship, like sun worship with the daisy. I have it up here, yeah. The daisy follows soft the sun, very famous poem, where the daisy is admiring or really worshiping this sun figure that is, whether that's a person or God or however you want to interpret it. And this really reaches its culmination in what are known as the master letters, a few draft letters that were unsent to an unknown recipient, referred to only as master. They're extremely impassioned and probably have received more scholarly attention than any two letters in all of English language literature. And she, again, she is not a daisy, she is Daisy, and she is embodying this, the way this plant behaves, facing the sun, like totally adoring and worshiping of this master figure. Another plant I think of as important is really how it became used as emblematic of her is the ghost pipe or Indian pipe. Unfortunately, her specimen got obliterated. They're a little difficult. They often have bugs in them when you press them, and then by the time you open it up when it's dry, they're all chewed up a little bit, and that might have happened here. This is a plant that doesn't behave like other plants. It doesn't produce chlorophyll. It's got a complex relationship with soil fungi that are related to tree roots. It's sort of parasitic on a fungus that's in symbiotic relationship with the tree. This quick ecology lesson. Bizarre plant. And she has a couple of poem mentions where she invokes the Indian pipe as, you know, this white, pure, chaste thing. But more importantly, Mabel Loomis Todd, who became her first editor and major proponent and promoter, who was also her brother's lover, mistress, painted this, it's not this panel, but she painted a panel of ghost pipes and gifted it to Dickinson, who apparently she never met. And Dickinson wrote back with this enthralled letter that you sent me the preferred flower of life. So this is probably in the phase of Dickinson's life where she was wearing her famous white dress and was very reclusive and mysterious and behaving quite unlike other people in her society. So Mabel Loomis Todd really grabbed onto this quote and used it heavily in promoting Emily Dickinson. This is Mabel's art on the cover of the 1890 edition of Dickinson's poems, her first published book of poems, posthumously. Also on her letters a few years later. And if you are in Wildwood Cemetery, Mabel Loomis Todd's headstone has the Emily Dickinson quote and an image of the ghost pipes on her headstone also. We talked a lot about a bunch of orchids, but this is a really important orchid. So there are 15 orchids in the herbarium. They're all native wildflowers. There are no glasshouse tropical conservatory orchids in her herbarium. They're all wildflowers. And I know she didn't grow them because you can't just, the technology to grow orchids was not really, even now it's quite a challenge. So those are definitely wildflowers. And this plant is important because she's buried with this plant. She died on May 15th, 1886, was buried 2 days later, and observers report that she was, among other things, a heliotrope and some violets. She was buried with what would have been, just out of the ground, pink lady slipper. This is one of our most common orchids today, but it would have grown in woods that had been woods, and so somebody must have gone out in the woods in mourning to collect this, with some meaning that we may never know. The last plant that I want to talk about is the fringed gentian. This is the plant I like to associate with Dickinson because I love this plant. And I'm pretty sure she loved it in a special way too. Things that are said about the gentian, so I know it's purple, but botanists call this blue. I have a theory that the male botanists in the 19th century earlier on had blue-purple color blindness more prevalent. It's pretty prevalent in my family, but so this is called blue. And so the gentian has this fringed petal that it's like an eyelash. It's an eye open to heaven, observing the sky. So there's like a lot of this imagery. William Cullen Bryant has an ode to the gentian poem that Dickinson surely read. This is a stunning but elusive plant. It's a biennial, and if you've ever tried to track down biennials, they kind of seem really abundant one year, and then they collapse another year, and you think, what happened? And it's disappearing, and then they have another profusion. So somebody told me once, if you go there, once you find one, you'll start seeing them all over the place, and that seems to be the way it goes with this plant. Once you find one, then they're tucked in all over the place. And it's really just mind-blowing once you start finding them. Well, I'm get ahead of myself here, but so she doesn't say, I found a fringed gentian. She never says fringed gentian anywhere, but she mentions the fringes, usually, almost all of her gentian references. So we're pretty sure, when she says the gentian, I'm pretty sure she's always meaning the fringed gentian, even though the herbarium has a bottle gentian, which she misidentified, which is also present in Amherst. But what makes this important to her, the gentian appears in a number of poems, but most importantly, figures prominently as the first fascicle in the first fascicle. The first line of the first fascicle that she decided to assemble is the gentian weaves her fringes. So somehow she was meditating on this plant, and that was sort of like the first step into this composition or assembling this group of poems was the gentian, and that sort of sets the tone for this set of poems, which again seem maybe unrelated, but that's also hotly debated. The gentian appears twice in the first fascicle, kind of as not as a personal identity, kind of as like this entity outside of her, which I'm not going to analyze on the top of my head, but and also she has another one of my favorite poems that also occurs in one of the later fascicles in 1863. I'll read this one fully. God made a little gentian, it tried to be a rose, and failed, and all the summer laughed. But just before the snows, there rose a purple creature that ravished all the hill, and summer hid her forehead, and mockery was still. The frosts were her condition. The Tyrian would not come until the north invoke it. Creator, shall I bloom? And this, the thing about the gentian, this fringed gentian, is it blooms in the fall, often after the frost. This is another plant that doesn't behave like the other plants. And the ecology of that plant that's blooming late is embedded in this poem. Later than the rose, the frost is in this poem. There's sort of this, I picture this as the aster and goldenrod season. And there's also this tension at the ending, this rhetorical question of like, I see this in nature, that there's a time, it's not too late to bloom. She turns to her God and says, is it time for me now? Almost like saying, if you don't answer me, I'm going to act upon the advice I'm getting from this plant. And she almost becomes this plant also. It's not quite seeing the plant and it's like, I'm going to be the gentian because this is the right example for me to follow. So this is Dickinson at 32 years old, infusing this poem with context and invoking this visceral experience of finding a fringed gentian when she was younger. And that imagery is still vivid 20 years later in her life. And there's also what's not stated in the poem, but was embedded within it, is this whole experience of being out in autumn looking for wildflowers, which somebody in this room has been on a field trip with me, finding fringed gentian in October. And it's just thrilling that you can find something so beautiful and stunning and profuse when you think the season is done for. And really like the whole finality of the season, that crispness in the air, the starts of the tinges of color, like all of that is the smell of that goldenrod season. All of that is embedded within this poem because she possessed that experience. And I do want to counter that, it's tempting to say she anthropomorphizes flowers, but I really see her as botanicalizing the human experience, sort of, the lives of the flowers and they're the tangible examples that hold the lessons of how to grow, how to coexist with your neighbors, how to achieve success, how to deal with loss. These are things she understood by observing plants and then used those as models for how to deal with the human experience. The lives of the flowers are more comprehensible in that way. So by being a close observer of these flowers throughout her whole life, she basically learned from them and understood them and then invoked them in her poetry in order to explore all of the complex subjects which preoccupied her, like life and death and immortality. And I argue that she couldn't have done this had she not been a botanist first. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. There's so much in that, including an invitation as we're waiting for the snow to melt to to scratch that itch by going into a poetry book. Certainly a better choice than reading a mid-19th century flora word for word. I don't
Whatever
know. Many
floats your
people
boat.
have the the tolerance for that. Thank you so much. We have some time for a few questions before going down to Lyman. In particular, if there's students in the audience that have a question, but I'll bring the mic to you if folks want to raise a hand if you have a question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for that. I'm wondering about the yellow lady slipper, or was it the yellow lady slipper that had sort of damage to some of the specimens, and if you have any thoughts on what her encounters might have been like with that plant at that time.
Are you asking about the damage or just where she might have found it and seen it? Or
I guess the damage, like
Yeah, the
what about
damage-
that plant
all right.
sticks out?
Yeah, the damage, that was kept in the back binding, so it wasn't mounted, and it's a little bit of a mystery. But the plant, there are a bunch of plants in the back of the book that haven't really been given attention either, and I'm writing another essay on that presently. But the damage is just common bug damage that's herbarium specimens are known to suffer from when they're not kept in dry storage or heat treated or cold. All my specimens get freezer treated to kill all those bugs that eat plant tissues and glue and things like that. So that's a common thing to see on old specimens. Those are, they're almost 200 years old. And now they're safe because they're in a vault in Harvard, but they were in a box for decades in somebody's New York City apartment and suffered a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great. I'll stand. I have a question. So we work a lot with students here. I work here at Smith, and I'm just curious what advice you would give a student who sees you and is listening and hearing about how you're a botanist, but also you're clearly excited by this poet and this figure. How do you kind of think about bringing these things together? What really drove some of this? That's a big question, but I'm curious if you could give some advice to students who might be thinking kind of interdisciplinarily.
Yeah. I don't know how it happens. I just can't stop thinking about it, I guess is how it happens. Once I think about it 3 times, then I figure I should start taking notes about it. I think staying curious is half the battle. And I think you see a lot of people trying to monetize their passion, and it's not valid unless it's monetizable. And I don't do this I just do it because I have to, because I can't stop thinking about it. And I also started realizing I needed to make use of my time once my kids got older and I had energy to do so. And this became sort of how I filled that time with infatuation. So I think being passionate about something and pursuing it and prioritizing it is really what I do. People often say, "How do you have time for this?" And I say, "I don't know. How are people spending their time? They don't have time for this. I don't watch TV. I guess I don't have any dissipative activities. So this is just where my brain wants to spend time, and I value that, and it brings me joy. So that's also important. Anything else?
Hello, first of all, thank you. That was a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I was just curious. I heard you mention that the way she preserved the flowers were not just sticking them in between pages of books. So could you elaborate maybe what some of her techniques were
Sure.
to preserve the flowers then?
Sure.
Thank you.
So the one piece missing is we don't have when you press a flower that's wet, it usually stains the page and bleeds into things. So there's a lot of changing of papers, and I use blotting paper in between newsprint. And those are the dirty stuff. And we don't have that. But that's probably how she did things before, just pressing in between newsprint or paper similar to that coir, and then changing it frequently so that the paper was taking moisture out until the specimen's dry. So it's another thing where you're revisiting the specimen over and over again as it's drying and making sure that things are folded right and manipulating things. And then once it's dry, then it gets translocated into one of these final destination type things. So, but I don't think they had blotting paper in the way we have. I use cotton rag blotting paper, which is pretty commonly available, but it was probably just paper and maybe some heavy paper that can absorb, and it's something to get the moisture out and flatten it, put it under weight. So that's more or less the process. That hasn't changed too much over the course of time. Thanks.
Thank you. Just following up on that, you had mentioned the daisies and the way they were composed on the page. And could you say a little bit more about intentional composition? Is that part of herbarium collections?
Intentional composition with symbology, I think, is probably uncommon in other herbaria. Some of our contemporary Mount Holyoke College herbarium I showed has some bouquet type arrangements. One of her classmates has an herbarium where there are bouquets that are tied with a little bow that are so sort of that's about as much composition as I've seen in collections. In the paper that came out in the summer, I speculate on one particular page and what some of the specimens might mean. I really went on a limb in the Dickinson world by doing that, but I don't have time to get into that, but it's at least a plausible way to say that maybe these are symbolic for things in her life, in her world, and the way she arranged them that transcend the disorder. But very probably important. Just have to figure it out. Thank you.
Noting that Peter's kindly said that, well, he's going to be coming down to Lyman with us and is willing to take more questions down there. We'll take one more question here in the audience.
I loved your presentation of the idea of, like, rather than anthropomorphizing the flowers, she's I don't know how do you say that, but botanicalizing human life. I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more to, like, kind of the meaning you see in that distinction, because that I feel like very frequently we talk about like metaphors that apply human perspectives onto plants as a way to, like, that people can connect to plants. But I've actually never heard of it talked about the other way around, and I think that's an interesting distinction.
Yeah, thank you. It'd be hard to talk off the top of my head on this. Like, I agree that, the projecting human values onto plants really rubs me the wrong way usually, especially trees. So, I feel like just understanding plants as beings is like the fundamental part of that, which is, as modern society has a fundamental problem seeing that as a basic fact, that plants are living beings and they're engaged in the struggle for life, and they're dealing with all of the same things in the world as us, except they can't move, except when they produce seed. So, all of those struggles, like, and even there's a great poem about a plant striving in the meadow grass, like with its neighbors, and like trying to get up, but also trying to, like, assert itself, and like just finding your place, dealing with where you are, dealing with all of the things that happen around you, like bees coming in and butterflies, the wind, winter, all these struggles are relatable because we all find ourselves wherever we are and dealing with things we have no control over. And I think that is really foundational for why I think that's important and why she was so able to wield that in an important way. So I could probably write a whole essay on that someday, but I'm glad you thought it was important too. Thanks. Like John said, I'll be taking a stroll through the plant house, so casual questions are welcome there too. But thank you very much. I appreciate you coming.